So I suppose we can go ahead and begin. Why don't we start with a little kind of grounding meditation and carry that sort of into our prayer for refuge and bodhicitta. So find a comfortable seat. Where your mind and your body can be relaxed, yet your mind still attentive. Gently release anything that's capturing your attention right now from your other parts of your day, or perhaps something in the future. And settle into some present moment awareness. If something interrupts that present moment awareness, you can consciously release it, mentally let it go, and bring your mind back into the here and now. And as our mind is settled just a little bit more, you can bring your attention to your motivation for joining this evening. In general, for studying the Dharma. Maybe even specifically what you had in mind with your activity this evening. And in order to accomplish that, we can imagine all of our activities contributing specifically to that aim. Including our actions of taking refuge and generating bodhicitta through the prayer. So I don't know if we have, looks like there may be a email requested, but we're we're a moment past that. So I'll go ahead and recite slowly. Many of you may know the Refuge and Bodhicitta prayer. We'll do the version, like I've said before, where instead of saying by listening to the Dharma, through my merits of listening to the Dharma, it'll be through my merits from giving and other perfections, or through my practice of giving and other perfections. So that's the one I'd prefer to use. So the prayer goes, I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my practice of giving and other perfections, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my practice of giving and other perfections, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my practice of giving and other perfections, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. So we can rejoice that we've made that step, taken that action of directing our mind, directing our focus, directing our activities to be of benefit to ourselves and to countless others as well. Welcome. There's some people that are coming back who we've seen for the past couple of weeks, and some new people as well. You're welcome. This is a relatively, I don't know how I call it, kind of loose discussion-based, well, sort of discussion-based little teaching that we're going through on the small scope of the Lamrim. So it's based on Lama Tsongkhapa's Lamrim Chenmo, the Great Treatise on the Stages of the Path to Enlightenment. And we're going to be focusing on what are called the teachings of the small scope. Specifically, one of my emphases is to try to get us to engage personally with those teachings. So we'll see if we can accomplish that. I should rephrase that. Part of my motivation is to try to get me to engage with the teachings, and hopefully you may find something worthwhile there, and find your own path or some other little bit of information or something worthwhile there as well. So in the last class, we talked a bit about precious human rebirth, and we didn't dig too deeply into it. We have a relatively compact course, and instead of going through and explaining to the best of my ability all of the lists, the 8 freedoms and 10 opportunities, or we articulated them but didn't dig too deeply into them. I think it's important for us to learn that list. It's a good thing to do, but then to take that list and to see if there's something that can help us bring the purpose of that list or those lists into our own individual experience and in our own minds, right? Because one of the teachings in this small scope is like different types of rebirth that are less advantageous for spiritual practice than being human. That's a kind of a remote concept for Westerners by and large. But that doesn't mean we can still dig into those teachings and start to think about them and say, oh, I get the point of this aspect is like, wow, I do have a lot of opportunity that I really maybe hadn't considered before. And if we can make that sort of personal translation, we can appreciate that the tradition is articulating some viewpoint that might be a little bit foreign, but this kind of kernel in it is still relevant, even if I don't believe in past lives or rebirth, for example. I can still recognize the value of the opportunities that I have, or the conditions that I have right now to be able to practice, to have a spiritual community, etc. So that's one of the things that I encourage people to do. We get to do this personal kind of exchange and personal engagement with the Buddhist tradition, because it's articulating perspectives that are really different than our own. But that doesn't mean that they're necessarily right or wrong, or it doesn't mean that we have to take all of it or none of it, right? So we get to find our way and figure out what makes sense to us. But the key is to try to understand the reason why these perspectives are being articulated in terms of mental transformation. Like, what's the reason? What's this supposed to do to my mind? How is my mind supposed to respond? And if we can get that perspective, if we can understand that, then we can honor the tradition by understanding the viewpoints that it's articulating, but also honor it in the sense of like, oh, actually getting the meaning of it. So I look down a lot because I have a lot of notes. I work from a lot of notes. So hopefully that isn't too distracting for you. One of the things that I also find to be really helpful that we did talk a little bit about was in terms of human rebirth, being able to reflect on times in our own lives when our ability to do whatever it is we wanted to do, whether that was spiritual practice or some other activity, to reflect on the instances, and I think spiritual practice is the more relevant one in this case, but reflect on those times when it just hasn't been possible, right? Either our mind is particularly occupied with something, or, like I have a friends of mine who they're due to have a baby, right? So I'm sure their mind is like really occupied in that. That could be a very spiritual thing. They're not especially spiritual people. But it's like, that's what's in their mind right now. And maybe their spiritual practice, if they were to have it, would be on the side. Or if there are times when, work is really busy, or we're under some sort of physical duress, or, we're ill or something like that. So we can have our experiences in our lives where our ability to engage in spiritual practice is limited just by virtue of the conditions that we have. And when we can recognize those situations, then we get a sense of, oh, that's an aspect of these leisures and opportunities, not the way that they're traditionally articulated, but it's an aspect in that we don't at those times have all of the conditions for being able to do spiritual practice in the most efficacious way, right? And this happens at various times throughout our lives. But we also can recognize those times when it's like, oh, actually, I do have all these tremendous opportunities, and the conditions are ripe for me being able to do some spiritual work. I do think it's helpful to consistently reflect on the great fortune that we have, and that those conditions will change. This is kind of the point of precious human rebirth and the teachings in the small scope on death and impermanence, right? We do have this tremendous set of causes and conditions, these tremendous opportunities, but they're not going to be around forever. And making them consistently kind of with us is going to be something that I think is going to add a little bit more energy to our spiritual practice, and maybe help with a little bit of the continuity that we need. So one of the other prayers that's really common in the Gelug tradition, the tradition of Lama Tsongkhapa, is one of the short little texts that he wrote, which is called The Foundation of All Good Qualities. And that is basically a glance meditation of the entire path to enlightenment. So it's basically got sections that go through all of the topics in the Lamrim Chenmo, and then there's a little section on Tantra as well. But it's a really nice tool to have because, it's a really nice teaching to have available because it gives us in a matter of just a couple lines the synopsis of each of the main kind of points and an aspiration with that as well, right? So it's kind of, we get a review of these topics in the small scope, for instance, and then there's also an aspiration, like, oh, may I be able to do this that is related with each of those points, right? So I think it's a nice way of being able to come back to the point of the teachings and to be able to make that sort of the energy of our own aspirations kind of give it some continuity and give it a little bit of strength. If any of you have the FPMT Essential Buddhist Prayers, Volume 1, the Foundation of All Good Qualities is in there on page 98. Maybe it'd be nice to go through it, but maybe we'll just pause and go through that later. Maybe I can get that email. I'm not the best at multitasking on the sending an email while I'm trying to to communicate other ideas is not a strong suit of mine at the moment. So,
excuse me, I didn't mean you to email it. You can drop it into the chat, whatever PDF or document you've got.
Oh,
yeah.
I didn't know that. There's a
just drag and drop.
Oh. Huh. It didn't seem to like that initially. Let's try again. Thank you for the redirection. My Zoom skill is limited, so it's good to learn that that's a possibility. So it looks like that might have come. Fantastic. So in the section that we have right here, it's just from the opening phrase, which is on devotion to the spiritual teacher, which, in the Lamrim Chenmo, that's the very first topic. And then it goes through the points of the small scope. The text continues. I want to make that clear, right? It's not just these 4 verses. And there's also a nice link there that you might find that's obscured, but when we go through it, we can have that back up. That there's a nice commentary by Kunu Lama Rinpoche on the Lama Yeshe Wisdom Archive there. So that HTTPS is going to be, a nice little link to have. So you can get, it actually has this copy of this translation of the Foundation of All Good Qualities, but Kunu Lama also gives you it's a pretty brief commentary. It's not like you're in for 240 pages on the Foundation of All Good Qualities, but it'll help flesh out the sort of some of the points in there as well. So being able to use something like the Foundation of All Good Qualities in something that we do on a daily basis or twice a week or once a month or something like that. But as we start to get those words and we start to have that become part of the fabric of our minds, it becomes more accessible, right? And it helps us to remember the points too, right? If you're like, oh, what was in the small scope? Oh, I remember I was reading, I either have the outline of the Lamrim Chenmo, which gives you the points too, or something like the Foundation of All Good Qualities. So we can, maybe go ahead and do a quick recitation of this. One of the ways of we're going to go just straight through each one at a casual pace. But one of the ways it can be done as well is you can stop at the end of each verse and do a little bit of meditation on that one specifically. Another way of doing it is to recognize where, okay, here's the small scope section, and then meditate at the end of the small scope section. And then, oh, here's the middle scope section and meditate at the end of that, etc. This is the small scope version or the first section. So we can maybe recite these together. So the foundation of all good qualities is the kind and perfect pure guru. Correct devotion to him is the root of the path. By clearly seeing this and applying great effort, please bless me to rely upon him with great respect. Understanding that the precious freedom of this rebirth is found only once, is greatly meaningful and is difficult to find again. Please bless me to generate the mind that unceasingly, day and night, takes its essence. This life is as impermanent as a water bubble. Remember how quickly it decays and death comes. After death, just like a shadow follows the body, the results of black and white karma follow. Finding firm and definite conviction in this, please bless me always to be careful, to abandon even the slightest negativities, and accomplish all virtuous deeds. So far we've talked a little bit about understanding that the precious freedom of this rebirth is found only once, a little bit about this life is as impermanent as a water bubble. But we haven't talked very much about, please bless me to always be careful to abandon even the slightest negativities and accomplish all virtuous deeds. The point of that is that fourth verse there is actually how we accomplish the goal of the small scope. The goal of the small scope practitioner, or the practices in common with the small scope, is to have a better rebirth, or from a medium scope or great scope perspective, to have rebirths that are continually conducive to our spiritual development. So we can exit samsara, so we can be liberated from samsara, so we can attain our nirvana, and so we can continue our development of bodhicitta and wisdom so that we can become a Buddha, right? From a Buddhist perspective, it is possible to do those things in one lifetime, but sometimes it takes a bit longer than that. So we can maybe take I don't know that we need that much more right now. So the basic idea is that in order to be able to affect a better rebirth, and I mean affect as in make it happen, like to bring it about, we need to know, one, how to do that. And we also need to do it. We need to act in such a way to be able to make that happen. So the two other topics that we haven't really mentioned much are refuge and refuge and karma. And those two are the way that we develop this awareness of how to act. And they also call us to task for acting in the ways that are virtuous. Virtuous in this context means an action is going to produce positive results. It's going to be, what's the best way to say? I'm a little, I guess maybe I'll do it by the negative. Something that's considered non-virtuous is going to have a suffering result, right? So an action that is non-virtuous is an action that it eventually is what we would consider harmful for us. A virtuous action is going to be one that brings about the positive qualities or the perspective, the wisdom that we're trying to accomplish on the Buddhist path. So when we start to move into looking at the topic of refuge and into karma, so there's a very detailed sort of analysis and explication of what karma is in the small scope section of the Lamrim Chenmo. When we do that, we're going to be engaging in activities that reduce our ignorance, that reduce our afflictions, And we're also going to be engaging in actions that are going to increase our wisdom, that are going to increase our positive qualities, our equanimity, love, compassion. We take refuge and we observe karmic cause and effect because we understand that we have a tremendous opportunity and it's not going to last forever. I've been talking a lot. How is this? Are any thoughts or questions arising thus far? Curiosities or deep concerns? I'm open to those too.
Guys, just unmute yourselves. It's a nice small group. Go for it.
I'll just comment that what I find helpful is I've been, somewhat acquainted with what you're saying, but it's like I realize that for me, simply listening to this is kind of a form of insight meditation for me. And it's really helpful because I get to take on board in a deeper kind of way, just simply, I guess, with, hearing it again. So I really value that. So I want you to know that. Thank you.
Great. Glad to repeat it in such a way that it helps or articulate it, right? It's like, that's one of the beauties of the tradition. Aaron last week had asked, like, should we go back? If we've already gone through a section in the Lam Rim, should we go back? And it's like, well, of course, because, most of us haven't like actually got it on the first or second or 15th read through, right? It takes some time. So I'm glad that's helping you, Jai.
Thank you. And yes, I do recognize I'm not a one-time learner. I need repetition in everything, frankly. So it's great.
Yeah.
Yes, it's also helpful for me to hear it from your perspective, which is slightly different. I mean, it's new. And so I appreciate that. It helps me to understand things I've related that I learned previously, but didn't really learn. And now I'm connecting, making a connection with them. So that's very useful. That's a good sign of learning.
Yeah. And please, you weren't here for the first session where I said, I articulate, I've studied this stuff quite a bit, but there are obviously people that have studied it way more. I do encourage you to, like, anything you hear from me, like, check up on it. It's like, I'm doing the best I can, but I don't want to lead anybody astray. But part of my approach to this is it's definitely non-traditional, right? In the sense of, I study with Yangtze Rinpoche as a Larampa Geshe. If you're in Santa Fe, you've been studying, maybe, or I hope you've been able to study with Geshe Thupten Sherpa. He's a brilliant Geshe as well, right? And their style is a little bit a little different, but hopefully the way that things are coming across is integrated, like you were saying, but maybe you can shed some light in a way that's helpful. So thanks, and I hope it continues. So I want to talk a little bit more about impermanence, and maybe do just a brief little bit on the death meditation. That's I forget how it's actually linked in the class page, but it's meditation on the 3 new roots, 9 reasonings, and 3 conclusions. So this really brief but powerful meditation. So reflecting on impermanence is something that is extremely helpful, I think, for our Dharma practice. And I think by doing it consistently, we can start to appreciate how so much is changing. There's continuity with things, but so much is changing. And, one moment we believed we had a long time to, something was going to be available for a long time. And then all of a sudden it isn't, right? This is particularly, like one of my friends, at 20 years apart, both of her parents died suddenly, right? So she has a tremendous opportunity, to experience the grief of that, but also like, as much as they're able to like let that into their own heart, this idea of impermanence, like, can be very real for them, right? They weren't expecting, they were both sudden deaths and they weren't expected at all. So, so in the Lamrim, the teachings on impermanence are kind of supplemented with the idea, with this other teaching from Shakyamuni Buddha that basically is what were called the four white seals. The first of which is all compounded phenomena are impermanent. And it's easy to say those words. It's a little bit more difficult to get at the meaning, and it's even more difficult to recognize the applicability of that reality, that conventional reality, to our daily lives. Because usually in our day-to-day lives, we don't think we are a compound phenomena. This physical body is obviously made up of lots of different parts and lots of different elements. This kind of union of mind and body for us is unique, and it's a putting together. And this person that's Daryl is not going to continue forever. Thank goodness. There's lots of room to grow. May the next opportunity be as good or better. May I maybe enter the path a little bit sooner and with a little more wisdom, skip some of those, afflictions earlier on. I guess I'm trying to do this now so that happens, right? That's the point of this. But typically in our everyday lives, we're not staying connected with our own fallibility, our own mortality and our own fallibility in that way, right? And I'm not necessarily advocating that we jump right in and every single moment, every single thing we see, we realize that it's actually made of things and it can disintegrate and, it's all going to fall apart. That's not what I'm advocating right here. That could be worthwhile for some people at some point in their spiritual practice, but what I'm advocating is just trying to get a little bit more consistency with, oh yeah, my time could be sooner than I think. And because my time could be sooner than I think, I'm going to spend a little bit more time doing the things that are actually valuable to me, the things that I think that will actually benefit me in the rest of this life, and perhaps, as I was just saying, in whatever iteration comes next, right? Whatever continuity, how the continuity emerges down the road. So kind of with that in mind, the basic idea of this meditation on death is, and I'm sorry, I was looking down. Scholar, did you have a hand up or anything like that? Okay, great, thank you. So we meditate on the what are called the three roots, the 9 reasonings. The 9 reasonings support those 3 roots, and then there's 3 conclusions that come from that. The 3 roots are death. These are relatively easy to comprehend. Death is certain. The time of death is uncertain is the second root. The third is specific to this tradition, to the Buddhist tradition in general, I think, and nothing can help us at the time of death except our Dharma practice. Death is certain is like, we're almost, as I was mentioning before, we go through life not realizing that we're going to, our time could be much sooner than we had anticipated. But the idea that death is certain is like, it's, I don't know the way to, it's like something is true, but you can't really wrap your head around it. Like the earth is round, it might be different. I don't know, I pick weird examples sometimes, but it's like, can you really wrap your head around the earth is round? I don't know. I mean, yes, because you could have a small globe or something like that, but experientially, it's harder to connect with, right? Again, maybe weird example, you can leave that one or develop it on your own. Maybe it's like a big number, a very large amount of money, right? It's like once it's a certain point, it's like the mind can't really comprehend how much that is and what it does. I don't know, another not ideal example. In our everyday life, death doesn't usually feel imminent, and it doesn't feel certain in the sense that it is going to happen. The certain, if somebody were hanging out at the bar in their early or mid 20s and they were just doing their life as normal, and somebody said death is certain, they'd be like, yeah, sure. There's no sort of space in the mind and the heart under most circumstances to allow that conventional truth to actually impact us, right? In this meditation, the time of death being uncertain is something that punctuates that even a little bit more, right? Because we're not only saying death is certain, which can be easily kind of dismissed, either like really consciously or just like, it's something that we don't really attend to. But then when we actually look at the situation and we realize that, and we do the investigation, do the analysis, and we realize that the time of death is uncertain, things get a little bit more serious for those of us relatively attached to this life. And we can reflect on either the reasons, which I don't want to necessarily go all the way through, but, like, for example, I'm sure at this point, all of us have known somebody that we weren't anticipating, that wasn't ill, that suddenly just passed away, either through a sickness or an accident or, X, Y, or Z other type of reason, right? So the time of death being uncertain really kind of calls us to be attentive to this. And then the third aspect is the tradition's going to say that our Dharma practice is the only thing that can help us at the time of death. That can be explained a little bit more when we talk about refuge, and particularly we'll talk about Dharma refuge. So I think it's kind of funny sometimes where I'm like, we're not going to worry about the reasons. You can come up with your own for why all of these things make sense. But, it's good to look, like I had mentioned before, like this is what the tradition is saying. But there's a way, I'm more interested in the specifics on the three roots, and then the three resolutions, or the three conclusions. So in relation to the first root, which is that death is certain, the idea is that we will practice Dharma. That's the conclusion that's supposed to come through the process. For the second one, reflecting that the time of death is uncertain, we're going to resolve to apply ourselves to the Dharma right now. Right? It's not something that's going to be put off because, you know, I could have 2 more breaths. So what time is there to waste? One of the good things about the tradition, especially, I mean, Lama Zopa Rinpoche is very good about this, I think, is like, we learn ways of integrating Dharma practice into everything that we're doing if we want to. And it doesn't have to be like forced or, you know, too like oversaturated. It can be very simple and very clean, I think. But we can do it often, nearly continually, arguably continually if we have vows and we're upholding them, but that's another topic. So reflect on the time of death being uncertain, and we're going to resolve to practice Dharma. And then the last one is, if Dharma practice is the only thing that's going to help us, we're going to resolve to practice pure Dharma. So Dharma actually is going to produce the result that we're looking for, which is to enhance our positive qualities, increase our wisdom, and to diminish our ignorance and afflictions. So this sort of condensed meditation is one way that we can develop more awareness of our impermanence and our inevitable death. Also, it's tangentially articulating the value of our human life. But I'm curious if you individually have other, I mean, maybe there's an aspect of that that really comes to light, or maybe it's like, oh, I have this other line of thought or thinking that will actually produce a similar result for me. That's one sort of line of inquiry. Another aspect that's really, I think, closely related to that is, like, what do we individually need to develop our awareness of precious human rebirth and impermanence and death? That's a really, you know, on the one hand, it's a tough question because it's like, oh, maybe I don't know clearly. But it's also a tremendously empowering question, because if we are engaging in our practice in such a way that it's like, oh, well, maybe this will help, then it's like, okay, well, then we try to go engage that or bring that aspect in or what have you. So I'd like to, you know, pause for a minute and give you an opportunity to consider those two things, and then maybe write something down, or, you know, just record it in whatever way would be beneficial for you. You know, so the two questions, one way to like reiterate them is like, what in my own experience helps me understand the point of precious human rebirth and death and impermanence? That may be, you know, it might be completely contained within the traditional perspective, but it also might be on the fringe of it a little bit. But what is that, you know? Can I place a marker from my own experience and own thought that helps me remember this aspect of the teachings? And then also, what, you know, so you may have some awareness of where you're a little bit limited in your engagement with or knowledge of precious human rebirth and death and impermanence. What do you need help fill that out, or to bring that more to life, or, you know, to enhance it in some way. So maybe we'll take like 2 minutes.
Those questions are in the chat if you're like me and can't remember anything. If I've not got it right, Daryl, please tell me. I've just typed as fast as I can.
Yeah, I think that's, yeah, good synopsis.
May I say something, Daryl?
Yes.
I think the power of real guttural stuff is a tremendous energy for anything.
Mm-hmm.
So great fear, great love, great whatever, just really pushes it. And I think that's the thing, you know, with the meditation in a charnel ground,
Mm-hmm.
which is a little tricky in the USA, but
Mm-hmm.
is something you can actually do in India.
Hmm.
That kind of just grabs you by the,
Yes.
yeah, that's it. That's my thought.
Yeah. I think that an interesting parallel is coming up into my mind with that example, because I think, Paola, that's absolutely right. You know, the things that are in our face, like, you can't escape the teachings, because they're just, you're just inescapable in these environments, right? Or through these experiences. And that's a really valid and important part of the process. One of the interesting things, this is going to be a slight sideways, and then hopefully it will come back. One of the interesting things that Yangtze Rinpoche does at Maitripa College with his teachings on emptiness meditation, you know, he does say that, yes, you know, when we're trying to find the object of negation, again, technical language here, but when we're trying to find the sense of I that wants to stand out against everything else, this is my own language for it. This isn't Yangtze Rinpoche's language for it. But when we're trying to find that, the tradition will often say, you know, when you're trying to get this I that's projected, that is the center of this self-grasping, one of the examples that they will often use is when somebody falsely accuses you of something. So when we're falsely accused of something, most of us are like, forget it, that's not me. You know, there's this boundary that is established around the self. This is, again, that aspect is my language for what's happening. But the point is, the self is like, not me. How dare you falsely accuse me of doing X, Y, or Z, right? This is kind of like the description of the charnel ground as I'm seeing it right now. It's that extreme moment where, oh, it's present, it's in your face, it's there, right? You as long as you stay there in that situation, you can't really hide from it. But one of the things Yangtze Rinpoche says about this is yes, it's important to get a sense of I, in that kind of a situation. But then it's important also to be able to get to see where that same sense is manifesting in more and more subtle ways. And in this context, in the small scope in death and impermanence, yes, looking at it and looking at the sort of visceralness in those really intense moments is important. But we are also called to find the way that that's still operative, even in these moments and in these environments, in these conditions that aren't so extreme and in our face. Because if we can track the point and that we can track that conventional reality into these more subtle situations, then we know that our learning is getting deeper and more pervasive. We're integrating that teaching on a deeper level. So when somebody says death is certain, it's like there's still that tangible, yes, I am actually really not just cognitionally aware of that, but emotionally and experientially aware of that. Experientially is a weird word right there. But I'm emotionally aware of it. And I'm like, yes, the palpability of that statement is available. And same with that death is uncertain. And ideally, if we do enough study, we learn what Dharma is, we learn how it's supposed to work and operate, then we will be able to say, oh yes, actually Dharma practice is the only thing that's going to help me at the time of death. And I want to do it very cleanly and very, I want to practice Dharma in a very clean and efficacious way, right? Not mixed up with a bunch of things that will create other issues for us.
Daryl, can I ask for a clarification? Because I get confused about this intense magnification of the fear of death. Mm-hmm. Am I right? We're talking fear, or is that just my way of looking at it? That we're, well, fear of our ending, so to speak. Yeah. And that this is what I hear when I hear these conversations. And I think, for me, and God bless the nuns, but when I was in grade school, the emphasis was you want to take life and be a good person, right? To put it just very, very basically. And so for me, that's my motivation, is that I'm aware that, yes, I have a limited amount of time on the planet. And during that time, I want to be the best person I possibly can, however I end up defining all of the details of that. And yeah. I find that motivation, wanting to, we could call it self-actualize, that terminology, whatever. But that's what actually, to me, is a more positive motivator for doing spiritual work. Yeah. So am I misunderstanding that fear impetus around death?
I don't think you're misunderstanding. Well, I didn't quite catch where your understanding or misunderstanding would be. You gave what I heard was an alternative motivation for doing like spiritual practice and engaging life, right? It was more this emphasis on being a good person and doing good acts rather than recoiling from the possibility of death and what will happen as a result of our death.
That's accurate. So again, to me, that's a more positive motivation. So I don't quite get why there's such a huge emphasis on, you must remember, I am aware I am going to die sooner rather than later. And so I just get really kind of muddled around what this emphasis is. Why is that just considered to be an additional motivating factor for folk?
I would be really curious how one of our esteemed geshes would answer this question. So what I'm going to say is probably some blend of traditional and my own perspective. But I do think that there is an aspect of trying to motivate people. And also, I mean, within this traditional Tibetan Buddhist context, the belief is, or at least what the teachings are articulating, is our negative actions actually outweigh our positive actions by and large. So there is this sort of like, hey, you know, the reality of the situation is you have a lot of stuff that's unresolved that could produce a next life that is not, I mean, that, well, I'll just put it frankly, is really imbued with suffering, right? And so that perspective is definitely part of where this tradition is articulating things from. They're going to say it's articulated from that because, you know, the Buddha could actually see past and future lives, right? You know, they're not trying to say, and they'll say any highly realized beings have those sorts of abilities too. And they'll also say each and every one of us can actually gain those awarenesses as well. So this is like, they're trying to, this is my read on it. The tradition is trying to say, with a deep and profound level of awareness, these are things that we would recognize, right? And we would recognize that we are liable to a lower rebirth, you know? That's a distinct possibility from this tradition's perspective. Sometimes you'll hear people, and they're, you know, from other like religious or kind of mixed spiritual traditions, you know, it's like, oh, you know what, we're just always, you know, it's always going to get better. You know, there's no backsliding. This tradition, I don't think, believes that at all. And it's on the one hand, yes, it's like, it's to kind of encourage us to move forward, but also there's an aspect of it that's like, you know what, your potential is far beyond that. Each of our potentials is like far beyond these suffering realms. So sometimes it's like, you know, a little motivation via like the negative catches some people's attention and works really well for them. But then if we look at the other side of it at the same time, it's like, well, of course, we like, wow, this is terrifying, but geez, I have this tremendous opportunity to develop spiritually and to do good things and to be beneficial. One other aspect that I would say, and this one gets a little bit more tricky, and I don't, you know, different people handle this differently, but we would know a little bit more about our fear or not fear at the time of death when we get closer to it. Some people fear naturally arises, right? It's just, that's what's coming through their mind. Other people are like, this is how I understand. Other people, like, they engage the process of death very, very easily, you know, and there's no sort of reticence or reservations with it. And I think that this teaching can be maybe particularly helpful for those people that are disposed to be afraid at that time. That's a me commentary too. Like, I don't know what my teachers would say about that, but it just kind of makes common sense to me a little bit. So I would encourage, like, if you can understand, as I've been saying, like really understand and have integrated the points of this without the death aspect of it, then from my perspective, there's no problem there.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And I have to admit, Daryl, I have thought that my motivation, I think it's true, if I was diagnosed with a terminal condition, there's no question in my mind, but that would be expediting the amount of meditation and spiritual work that I did.
Mhm.
actually. I got it. Yeah, that's, I see Paula recognizes that too for me. So thank you. I appreciate your input.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing. It's a good, it's important to have to feel comfortable asking those kinds of questions. Like it's kind of counter to what the tradition is saying in these teachings, right? And I think there's space for both. It's important to understand, as I said, what's the tradition saying and why the heck are they saying it in the way that they are? And how relevant is that for me at this time? And if not, is there something else that seems to do a similar thing? I think it's important if we see something that seems to do a similar thing for us, that we don't say that thing is necessarily Buddhism, right? We would want to have a conversation with a larger group of people, particularly very, very, very steeped teachers. Your spiritual guide would be the one that can say, oh yeah, don't worry about the death stuff right now. Maybe do this aspect of wanting to do good things, and that will bring out a similar result. So I personally am open to these sort of variations and perhaps deviations. Don't know. Would anybody like to share anything else that came to mind in those reflections?
Yeah, I'll say something.
Yes, Victor.
It's very interesting. I mean, I'm of that person that have fear of death because it's an unknown.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the reason I approach death through a Buddhist perspective, because it gave me some answers, but the answers are still very, for me, I mean, it's complex. It can, I understand what I need to do while I'm here. And so that's what I'm working on. But at the same time, because it's an unknown, there is that side of me that I say, well, will it really happen for me? Kind of like, am I going to be having a good, happy rebirth? Or, all of that, because I don't know. I mean, now, obviously I'm alive, I've never experienced death yet. So it's a very big question, but it does have the answers for me. It makes sense. Mm-hmm. So all the things like, the three roots I understand, death is for sure, and time is all of that. And also to answer your first question, my own experience, I have witnessed a death of a loved one. Mm-hmm. So it's very real to me, seeing someone who's alive, then he's gone. And so that is an eye-opener that, I've lost parents, but to someone that you love and then they're gone, it's so real, it's a fact. And so that, hit the nail really close to my heart in a way. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not sure about what the marker means. I mean, maybe I'm already explaining it, so I couldn't really answer the second. And the other teachings, I don't have other, I mean, to me, I guess the Buddhist point of view of death and life is very clear to me, or works for me. I don't know if I'm making sense or not, but and I understand that whatever you're doing when you're alive, creating all the virtues and the merits, doing all the practices, will come handy or will help you at the time of death. And just reading about it, I guess conceptually, learning it might help at the time of death, because you have all the practices, but it's very complex, and it just needs a lot of work, and I guess faith in that's going to really help me at the time of death with a happy rebirth. Okay.
Yeah.
I don't
Thank
know.
you. Thank you for sharing all that. I think that it's a legitimate approach to call the Buddhist perspective on death a good working hypothesis, right? We don't necessarily have the experience or the awareness that would affirm or confirm what the tradition is saying, but by and large, it makes sense. I have faith in my teachers, whatever it is. Like, yeah, this seems like enough of it adds up that I'm willing to invest some time and energy in cultivating these practices around death and dying or not, whatever, or just doing your normal prayers and stuff like that. All that stuff matters. So I think it's valid to think of it like, yeah, this is the best explanation I have. I'm going to move forward with that. So I want to maybe use a little different language for what it sounds like you were saying. Like, it's a great working hypothesis from my mind. We all get to do the experiment, right? Like, it's coming eventually. We get to figure it out. And, if it is right, then man, we've got a leg up in being able to navigate that. That's the idea, right? In terms of the questions on the side, there is a slight refinement that the description that you offered of having the death of a loved one that's very close to your heart is what I was kind of referring to as a marker. It's like that moment and that experience in your life that illustrates this teaching in a particular way that you can call up that experience. So it's like, oh, yes, the time of death is uncertain. Death is certain. The time of death is uncertain. If those two things, like those teachings, can be brought to mind and in conjunction with that experience, that's kind of what I was, of having your loved one pass. That's what I was kind of saying. Like, there's a marker. So it's like it brings like personal life to what those teachings are. That was the idea for that. And in terms of the last, just a slight refinement, I wasn't actually thinking of necessarily a different teachings or what sort of teachings from the tradition. That could be one way that we need something from that to help develop our awareness of precious human rebirth, death and impermanence, etc. But in my example that I wrote down is, I need more consistency with the reflection on it. Right? So it's like, I don't necessarily need more. I just need to do it more often. And that would end up enhancing it. Or if we don't have a close example for us that illustrates these teachings, maybe finding something like that would help. Or it could be, oh, you know what? I actually want to really understand these. I'm giving several different approaches to this last one. I really do want to conceptually understand the teachings on precious human rebirth. I want to memorize the eight freedoms and the 10 endowments. And I want to then look at those and see if I can find examples in my own sort of experience for them. So those would be maybe a slight refinement of the last question. My purpose is with bringing that about is like, you guys are probably like, okay, Daryl, we understand you're trying to help me get this personally. That's the point. It's our minds that we have to change. The intellectual knowledge is very important at times, but the experiential stuff is way more important at times. It's like people can be meditators that can be in cloistered environments, and then they come back into an environment that triggers them and they get triggered. It's like, oh, there's still work to be done. They can have the technique, they can have the teachings, you can have the conceptual mind. This is the transition from the wisdom of hearing to the wisdom of contemplation, and then the wisdom of meditation. This kind of a trajectory there.
I just want to add one comment for myself, like, I mentioned starting with fear of death, but I also remember reading saying that if you embrace death, then you won't have any fear. So that's kind of conceptually saying, death is part of living, being born and dying is part of it. So if I see that as a hypothesis or a theory or a concept, then I think at the time of death, as I get closer, I'm not going to be so fearful because everybody's going to die. It's not like just happening to me. It's like it's part of life. So maybe with that, it might help me overcome the fear with all the processes that at the time of death, the hypothesis we're talking about with Tibetan teachings, help me go through the process. And of course, hopefully with the good karma and all the things I've been doing in this lifetime, that's going to propel me to a better place. And that's all I can do right now. I mean, that's all we can do in a way. Okay, I just want to add that to that comment.
Yeah, thank you.
Daryl, would you like to hear one more?
Please, yes.
This is related to what Victor was saying. The god of death has a lot of names, and Sanskrit, I think, is Yama. And here in Japan, he's Emma. And he has two scribes that write the stuff, and it's beautiful art. Anyway, I am seriously into Emma, and I don't really know why. It's a natural thing. And when I go to Kyoto, I specifically stay near his temple. There's a temple dedicated to him. And the priestess there, she's something else. So just to say that there's a whole thing, if that was a thing for you that you wanted to address, there's a whole zone in which that can be addressed in a formal or informal way. I love Emma. I don't know why. I just do. Yeah.
No, that's great. It's also really interesting when we have those, like, I have a connection with this and I don't know why. It's quite fun. The tradition obviously says, it's a karma, right? You have some experience with it previously. Yeah, I'm sure that, I don't know much about other spiritual traditions, and I'm sure there are different approaches and views of the whole process of death. But, in this tradition, they are, they have a very clear idea of what the process of death is and the sort of agency that we should have in that or not that we should have. That's me saying, but the sort of agency that we are capable of developing in that process. So one path to not being afraid of death is like, I know what it's supposed to, I know what it's like. That's a whole, there are quite a few meditations that do go through the process of death. It's quite interesting.
Well, I have a comment on.
Yes, please.
To answer the question, what in my own experience helps me to understand death and impermanence? Now, I don't know if this makes sense, but it's what I wrote down. And it does relate to what Paula and Victor said in different ways. So I wrote, our experiences of intense suffering, and I relate this to personal experience that you cannot forget, helps me to empower my practice by understanding impermanence. For example, happiness, as we experience happiness, is impermanent. It turns to suffering. It often does. It usually does, perhaps. And suffering is itself a teacher, plus we have the Dharma that can teach the way out of suffering. Now, I don't know if that all makes sense, but that's what I wrote. It can teach us the way out of suffering if we're willing to understand and accept, really try to understand the Dharma in a personal way, as you were saying.
Yeah.
So in other words, intense suffering is just as happiness is, it's impermanent. They keep turning, they just keep turning, and we can hopefully influence it to a better direction.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah, I think that focusing on or bringing some awareness to the impermanence as we experience it in intense suffering, like thank goodness, whatever most intense suffering we have experienced in this life, first of all, may it never actually come about again. But what we had at that time, so thankful that it was, we didn't have to experience it for a moment longer, right? And it is kind of a bummer that the sort of pleasurable and positive experiences we have, that they are impermanent as well. But that's part of the beauty of a human rebirth, is we get both of those things. We get enough of the suffering to realize, oh, I don't really want to continue this if I don't have to. Unfortunately, the good news is we don't have to. And wow, there is some benefit, like there's some positive experience we can get that helps motivate us for like wanting to be free from the suffering that comes not always in the experience of the positive, but then when we lose it, there's definitely that's an aspect of the teachings for sure, So to be able to see the impermanence in both of those aspects, I think can be really, really helpful and help us recognize that this is something that we don't get to just pick and choose and apply it to whatever situation we prefer to. Yeah, I think that's quite good. There's something else that was coming into my mind, but it too was unfortunately too impermanent. I couldn't help but make the bad joke there, sorry. So we are coming close to the end of our time for this section, and I had hoped that we could have gotten a little bit further along, because I wanted to spend the last section talking mostly about karma, but it looks like we get to try to talk about karma and refuge, which are, from the small scope perspective, just to reiterate this, the activities of refuge and our observation and like tailoring our actions under the light of karma, so to speak. In other words, influenced by our understanding of cause and effect. Through those activities, we have the ability to affect a better rebirth, right? That's the purpose of the small scope motivation. Or we have the ability to affect a rebirth that is helpful for us to be able to have a realization of the nature of phenomena, and also to become an enlightened Buddha. So that's the idea. The precious human rebirth and death and impermanence are partly to help motivate us. They're to say, oh my gosh, like, yes, I have this opportunity, and oh, it's not going to last, and wow, I need to do something. So, so next time we get to talk a little bit more about what's involved with refuge, and then a little bit about cause and effect, which are both very like vast and somewhat challenging topics for me and for many Westerners as well. So hopefully we'll be able to continue with that. Are there any maybe questions that have come up in this process?
Can I just share? So the meditation on death is what brought me into Buddhism many, many years ago. I was suicidal and I was kind of yearning for death. And then going through all of the meditations, like I discovered my fear was living. Like I didn't know like why, and death was like going home. So I wasn't sure like why am I here? And going into karma and bodhicitta, I was like, oh, this is why I'm here. Like this is why this is a precious human life. And even though I've gone through different things since I started Buddhism, I've tried to reject Buddhism I don't know how many different times, and I always come back because the teachings are right. I hear the teachings in everything else. And like even most recently, it's like I go to science and science backs up what Buddha taught, and I'm like, oh, okay. And so that just kind of makes me realize yeah, like this is true. And when a loved one of mine passed away, it's like I didn't know what to do. And even though I knew about the Buddhism and blah blah blah, I was like, yeah, whatever. But now it's like I wish I would have held on to that a little bit more and just honored them that way, doing the rituals and just giving myself peace too. So yeah, that's just my little kind of answer to your questions. Thank you for this.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing. I appreciate your honesty, and it's in our own ways, we are often in this kind of like, I'm reluctant to use the word rejection with Dharma, but I have my own resistance, my own like, oh, this is challenging me, and this is a boundary I'm setting up in some way, shape, or form, and this is a normal process, right? I don't think that it's extraordinarily, I would suspect it's extraordinarily uncommon for somebody to, particularly somebody who grew up in a completely non-Buddhist context, to immediately be able to assimilate every single aspect of the teachings and all of the perspectives. Like, it's just, that's a big ask, right? And somebody would, I'll say it's possible, but it's, it hasn't been my experience. So yeah, whatever kind of path we need to follow that's ours. And I do appreciate that the tradition itself isn't, at least in the lineage of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, isn't an all or nothing kind of a thing, right? His Holiness always has said many times, like, whatever is helpful, you take it and use it. That's great. And whatever is not, then don't worry about it. Like, leave it. It's fine. He might get more technical once you do like engage in certain types of practice or something like that. But, in general, it's like, look, this stuff is supposed to help. When it helps, fantastic. The help is like, from the tradition's perspective, is like grounded in what they would say is a correct view of reality, and a way to help structure our activities in such a way that they reduce suffering and enhance our positive qualities. And that's the point. And if your engagement with the tradition is doing that, then that's great. If we kind of like hang out and do that sort of stuff for a while, but then something comes up and we move away, that's totally fine. But the door is never shut, Fortunately, for me, I don't know about you, but for me. That said, we can, we're just here in our last couple of minutes, and maybe we can reflect on all of the sort of positive actions that we've engaged in. Actually, we can bring that back and reflect and remind ourselves what our intention was here this evening, what we were trying to accomplish or just experience, or what we were on about in a good way. And hopefully it's very easy for you to see a clear connection between some of the actions that you have done this evening in this time and that aspiration. Hopefully it's very clear. And if it's not clear, we can make the aspiration as well that the merit from whatever positive actions that we have done this evening goes directly to our highest spiritual aspirations, so that merit helps to support, to affect those realizations. And we can also dedicate to the keeping open of doors for our spiritual progress. So regardless of the actions that we have performed in the past, that we'll perform in this lifetime, that we'll perform in the future, may we always have access to spiritual teachers and the spiritual lineage that will help us develop. So that we can participate in the elimination of all negative mental qualities, negative mental mindsets, actions of body and speech that happen on this earth and on every other planet for every other type of sentient being. So we can eliminate the cause of harm from our own mind, and to be able to benefit others. So if you have some sort of like little personal or big personal addition to that sort of dedication, you can do that. And then in just a moment, I'll lead the May the Supreme Jewel Bodhicitta, that little short verse. And also I'll do His Holiness's Long Life Prayer and Lama Zopa Rinpoche's as well in English. So whatever additional little dedication you have, please add that. And I guess we should do the Long Life Prayer. So in the land encircled by snow mountains, you are the source of all happiness and good. All powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. And Lama Zopa Rinpoche's Long Life Prayer. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjana's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers, honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. And may the Supreme Jewel Bodhicitta that is not arisen arise and grow. May that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. So I want to thank you all for being in this virtual space and connection this evening. And yeah, thanks for sharing.